The year was 1912. While the world watched the wreck of the Titanic and President William Howard Taft campaigned for re-election in the mountains, a way of life completely oblivious to modernity unfolded. Hidden between the valleys, the Caldwells held a tradition dating back generations. The women of the family were intended to unite with multiple men of the same clan, weaving a web of consanguineous relationships that defied all social and biological norms. Evelina Caldwell was but 16 years old when she became the protagonist of this obscure chapter in American history. Born in a rustic cabin in Hancock County, she grew up without any contact with the outside world. She was educated only in housework and the peculiar doctrines her grandfather, Silas Caldwell, imposed as absolute law. Silas, the patriarch, was a 67-year-old man whose wrinkled face and severe look spoke of hard years of labor and a distorted moral intelligence. With a grey beard reaching his chest and hands calloused from working the earth, he ruled his family with unquestionable authority. His justification for the practice of consanguinity was as simple as it was disturbing. The blood of the Caldwells must remain pure, without mixture. What is born of the mountain belongs to the mountain. The family's property stretched across some 200 acres of mountainous land, with 6 rustic huts spread over the terrain and connected by dirt trails. There lived approximately 30 family members, all descendants of Silas and his late wife, Sarah. Their isolation was not merely geographical, but ideological. The children did not attend school, and contact with outsiders was strictly forbidden. Tradition dictated that upon reaching a suitable age, Caldwell women should first join the older men of the family, other than their direct father, usually an uncle or first cousin. Then, progressively, they would become wives to other men of the clan, in a hierarchy set by age and position. The consequences of this practice were etched in the faces of the younger ones. Children born of these unions often bore visible physical deformities, prominent jaws, low foreheads, eyes set too close together, crooked fingers, and significant intellectual deficiencies. When it came to Evelina, the young girl with light brown hair and melancholy eyes understood only dimly what her family duty entailed. Her mother, Martha, had undergone the same ritual and now, at 35, looked a woman of 60, consumed by hard work and multiple pregnancies. Martha had birthed 8 children, of which only 3 survived, Evelina and her 2 younger brothers, both showing clear signs of cognitive disability. The first husband designated for Evelina was her uncle Ezekiel, her father's brother, a man of 45 years with a violent temper and precarious hygiene. The ceremony, if it could be called that, took place on a night of the full moon, with all family members gathered around a fire. Silas, as patriarch, led the ritual based on a distortion of biblical scripture and invented traditions, legitimizing what any outside society would deem an abomination. Evelina did not shed a tear during the ritual. Her face, illuminated by the firelight, showed a resignation that went beyond her years, the same empty look she had observed in her mother's and aunt's eyes. Inside Ezekiel's cabin, where she would now be forced to live, there was only a straw bed, a crude table, and a few chairs. The walls, made of poorly fitted logs, let the cold wind whistle through the cracks. What no one knew in that moment was that, unlike other women in the family, Evelina had experienced a brief contact with the outside world. 2 years earlier, during a rare trip to the nearest town to sell farm goods, she had spoken with a local teacher who, sensing her situation, had secretly given her a book. For months, Evelina had learned to read in hiding, absorbing ideas that showed her a reality beyond the mountains. While the other family members celebrated with homemade liquor, Evelina nurtured a seed of rebellion within herself. Beneath the straw mattress, hidden in a cloth bag, was the book that had changed her perspective, a collection of stories about women who had defied the conventions of their times. On the horizon, clouds gathered, foretelling a storm. The cold wind sweeping down from the mountains carried the scent of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. It was as if nature itself mirrored the inner whirlwind within Evelina. What no one could predict was that this young woman would set in motion events that would finally expose the Caldwell practices to the outside world, leading to the dissolution of generations of isolation and consanguinity. Check to see if you're already subscribed to this channel. You need to hear these true stories that reveal humanity's darkest secrets. Stories no one else has the courage to tell, but that we all need to know. Evelina's first weeks in Ezekiel's cabin established a pattern she feared would last her whole life. Rise before dawn. Prepare breakfast. Work in the garden. Wash clothes in the nearby creek. Cook, clean, and obey the demands of her husband when he returned from long hours hunting or working at the illegal still hidden in the property's caves. Ezekiel was not a man given to conversation. Nearly 3 decades older than Evelina, he treated her as acquired property, little different from the tools he used to till the earth or the animals he kept in the small pen behind the cabin. His face, perpetually red from the sun, and his calloused hands revealed a life of hard labor. But his eyes, set too close together, a common family trait, held a coldness that made Evelina shiver. During this time, Evelina carefully observed the family's rhythms and routines. The Caldwell women, though subjugated, had established a silent system of communication and mutual support. When they gathered to wash clothes at the creek or tend vegetables in the communal gardens, they exchanged meaningful glances and hasty whispers, sharing small strategies for survival. Evelina's Aunt Judith, a woman of 42 whose bent body and prematurely aged face told a story of deprivation, became her reluctant confidant. One October afternoon, as they gathered apples in the small orchard, Judith explained in a low voice the reality Evelina would face. After Ezekiel, your turn with Jeremiah will come. And after Jeremiah, the young Isaac, when he turns 18 come spring, Judith explained, her eyes constantly scanning to ensure they weren't observed. That's how it works here. Grandfather Silas says it keeps the blood strong. But look at the children. Look at my children. Judith had 4 living children by different family husbands. The eldest, a 15-year-old boy named Eli, could barely speak and struggled with the simplest tasks. His asymmetrical face, one eye visibly larger than the other, his jaw misaligned, was a silent testament to the effects of continued consanguinity. Silas won't let us see anything wrong with it, Judith continued. He says the children's difficulties are trials sent by God, not the result of our family arrangements. It was then that Evelina decided to share her secret with Judith. One night, when Ezekiel was at a meeting with the other men at the still, Evelina showed her aunt the hidden book and revealed that she knew how to read. There's a world out there, Aunt Judith, Evelina whispered, the pages glowing in the weak candlelight. A world where women aren't forced to wed their own kin, where children go to school and aren't born as ours are born here. The winter of 1912 to 1913 was particularly brutal in the mountains. The snow further isolated the Caldwell property, making the already rare trips to town impossible. Inside the cabins, lit only by fireplaces and tallow candles, the family survived on food preserved from the fall, smoked meat, pickled vegetables, cornmeal, and apples stored in a cellar. It was during this winter that Evelina discovered she was with child. The news, which in other circumstances might bring joy, filled her with a deep terror. She had seen the children born into the family. Many did not survive their first months, and those who did often had grave problems. Placing a hand on her still flat belly, Evelina made a decision. She had to escape before her baby was born into that world. The plan began to take shape during the long winter nights. With Judith's reluctant help, Evelina started storing small amounts of food, hiding them in a hole beneath the cabin floor. She also set aside spare clothing and, more importantly, began to study the rudimentary maps drawn in her book, trying to understand how to navigate the mountains to the nearest town. The greatest challenge would be avoiding recapture. The Caldwell family had ties to other isolated mountain communities, and Silas had made it clear over the years that desertion would not be tolerated. Whispered stories among the women spoke of past escape attempts that ended in tragedy. Her opportunity came in the early spring of 1913, with the thaw. The men of the family organized a 3-day hunting expedition to replenish pantries nearly empty after the long winter. All the women were left on the property with strict orders to prepare the gardens for planting. On the morning the men departed, Evelina embraced Judith in a silent farewell. The aunt, tears in her eyes, pressed a small bundle into her niece's hands, a few coins saved over many years, hidden in a fold of fabric. Go east, Judith instructed. Follow the creek. After 2 days' walk, you'll reach Rogersville. Look for the Methodist church. The pastor there is a good man. He'll help you." That night, under the protective cloak of darkness and guided only by a crescent moon, Evelina Caldwell left behind the only life she had known. Carrying a small bundle of food, some clothes, her precious book, and Judith's coins, she slipped into the forest, following the creek as instructed. What she did not know was that her escape would trigger a chain of events leading to the full exposure of the Caldwell family's practices, resulting in one of the first documented investigations into consanguinity within the isolated communities of Appalachia. Her 3-day journey through the mountains would be merely the start of a far greater transformation, not only for her own life, but for all the women and children left behind. As she walked through the dark woods, her hand instinctively resting on her belly where new life grew, Evelina felt something she hadn't known in years: hope. Evelina's trek through the mountains proved harder than she could have imagined. Familiar only with the Caldwell's immediate surroundings, she found the world beyond was both vaster and more perilous than her books had suggested. On her second day, a heavy rain soaked her and ruined her provisions. Hunger and exhaustion took hold. Finding shelter under a rocky ledge, shivering as she tried to light a small fire, Evelina felt her first true moment of despair. "What if it's better if I go back?" she whispered to herself, protective hands on her belly. "What if we die out here in these mountains?" The thought of returning to Ezekiel's cabin, of submitting once more to the system she'd fled, sent a chill through her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. No, she decided firmly. Any fate was preferable to that one. With renewed resolve, Evelina continued her journey as soon as the rain let up. At dusk on the third day, exhausted and starving, she finally spotted the first houses of Rogersville. The small town, with its dirt streets and modest buildings, seemed a metropolis compared to her life of isolation. With clothes dirty and torn, hair matted, and feet bare and bleeding from cuts suffered on the walk, Evelina drew looks of suspicion and pity as she made her way toward the town center, searching for the Methodist church Judith had mentioned. The church was a simple white-painted wooden building with a modest steeple and a small cemetery beside it. As Evelina approached the door, her legs finally buckled from weariness, and she fell to her knees on the entrance steps. This was how Reverend Thomas Wilson found her, a pregnant young woman, semi-conscious from exhaustion, mumbling incoherently about escaping the Caldwells. The Reverend, a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes behind round spectacles, needed little explanation. He had heard whispers about the isolated families in the mountains and their peculiar ways, though the full extent remained a mystery to most townsfolk. "My wife will see to you," he said gently, helping Evelina into the parsonage beside the church. "You're safe now." Martha Wilson, the Reverend's wife, was a practical woman with nursing experience. She tended to Evelina's injuries, fed her hot soup, and settled her into a clean bed, simple luxuries the young woman hadn't known for years, if ever. In the days that followed, as her strength returned, Evelina gradually told her story to the Wilsons. The couple listened with mounting horror to the details of life on the Caldwell property, the forced unions among close kin, the children born with disabilities, the absolute control wielded by the patriarch Silas. "What you describe as marriage is not recognized by law," Reverend Wilson explained carefully. "What was done to you and the other women is considered a crime in this state." The idea that the practices she'd known all her life were not only wrong but illegal was a revelation to Evelina. For the first time, she truly processed the abnormality of the existence she'd left behind. If your stomach is turning hearing this story, leave a justice for Evelina in the comments. It's vital that stories like this are known, so such atrocities never happen again. Meanwhile, back on the Caldwell property, the men's return from the hunting trip had sparked a crisis. Evelina's absence was immediately noticed, and Ezekiel, humiliated and enraged by his young wife's desertion, demanded retribution. Silas the patriarch organized a search of the property and surrounding woods, but Evelina's trail had been washed away by the rain. It was Judith who, risking her own safety, suggested that Evelina had likely perished in the forest, taken by hunger or wild animals. The notion, though macabre, temporarily sated the men's fury, and they soon turned their attention to more pressing matters, like preparing the soil for spring planting. In Rogersville, as weeks passed, Evelina's presence in the parsonage began to stir curiosity in the small community. Reverend Wilson, worried the Caldwells might discover her whereabouts, contacted a friend in Knoxville, a doctor named James Harrington, who had an interest in the study of consanguinity and its effects. Dr. Harrington arrived in Rogersville on a May afternoon, bringing medical equipment and a sharp scientific interest in Evelina's case. As one of the first physicians in Tennessee to formally study the genetic effects of consanguineous unions, he saw in the fugitive young woman a chance to document what had until then existed mainly in medical theory. "What you describe," he explained to Evelina during his initial examination, "is a system of extreme endogamy, far beyond what is typically seen even in isolated communities. The fact that multiple men of the same lineage join with the same women exponentially increases the risks to offspring." Examining Evelina carefully, Dr. Harrington noted subtle traits suggesting generations of consanguinity, a stature slightly shorter than average, a specific curvature to her jawline, a particular spacing of the eyes. While Evelina was fortunate to have no severe issues, the signs were there for a trained eye to see. "Your baby," he said cautiously, "is at significant risk. I can't say for certain, but modern science suggests children born of such close unions often develop serious complications." The news, though not entirely unexpected, devastated Evelina. Cradling her now visibly swelling belly, she wondered what kind of life she could offer a child who might face challenges from birth. It was Martha Wilson who comforted her that night, sitting on the edge of her bed as silent tears ran down the young woman's face. "You've already shown more courage than most folks show in a lifetime," Martha said, holding Evelina's hand. "No matter what comes, you won't be alone." By June of 1913, with her advanced condition making it impossible to hide her presence, word of Evelina reached the local sheriff. Concerned about the legal implications and the possibility of retaliation from the Caldwells, Sheriff Thomas Jenkins paid a formal visit to the parsonage. "Reverend," he said, removing his hat as he entered, "I've been hearing some disturbing rumors about a young woman sheltered here. Fleeing a situation, unusual, up in the mountains." What followed was a long conversation in which Evelina, with the support of Reverend Wilson and Dr. Harrington, relayed her experience. The sheriff, a man of rigid but righteous principles, was visibly disturbed by the account. "Miss Caldwell," he said finally, "what you describe are serious crimes under Tennessee law. If you're willing to give formal testimony, I can open an investigation." The decision Evelina faced was monumental. To officially denounce the family's practices would mean not only exposing Silas and the other men, but also bringing unwanted scrutiny upon the women and children she'd left behind. Yet to remain silent would allow the cycle to continue unbroken. That night, alone in her room at the parsonage, Evelina opened her worn book, the spark that had lit her path to freedom. In its pages, she found the courage she needed in the tales of women who had changed not only their own lives, but the lives of others around them. The next morning, with a firm hand upon a Bible in the sheriff's office, Evelina Caldwell gave her formal testimony. What she did not know was that her words would initiate one of the first official investigations into forced consanguinity in the United States, eventually leading to changes in state laws regarding marriage and child protection. As summer advanced and her time drew near, Evelina swung between fierce determination and absolute terror. The future, once so rigidly defined by the boundaries of the Caldwell property, now lay open before her, vast, uncertain, and, despite all challenges, finally hers to determine. On a sultry morning in July 1913, Evelina's labor began. Martha Wilson, with her experience as the community's informal midwife, prepared a back room of the parsonage with hot water, clean towels, and the medicinal herbs she used to ease childbirth. Dr. Harrington, who had extended his stay in Rogersville specifically for this, arrived soon after the first signs, bringing his medical bag and an air of professional concern. The labor was long and difficult. For over 20 hours, Evelina fought through intensifying contractions, her young and relatively healthy body striving to bring into the world a child whose destiny had been shaped by generations of choices not her own. "You're doing wonderfully," Martha encouraged, wiping sweat from Evelina's brow with a damp cloth. "Breathe deep, just as I showed you." In the small hours of the next morning, as the first light filtered through lace curtains, a baby girl was born, letting out a surprisingly strong cry that filled the room. Dr. Harrington examined her immediately, his experienced eyes searching for the signs he feared. The relief on his face was plain when he finally wrapped the newborn in a clean blanket and placed her in Evelina's arms. "She appears healthy," he said, allowing himself a rare smile. "We'll need to watch her closely in the coming months. But for now, you have a strong daughter." Evelina gazed at the small, red, wrinkled face, feeling a wave of protective love so intense it nearly stole her breath. The baby's eyes, though still unfocused, seemed to look right at her with an intensity that squeezed her heart. "Hope," Evelina whispered, gently touching her daughter's soft cheek. "Your name is Hope." The choice was no accident. Hope represented everything Evelina had risked her life to find, and everything she wanted for her daughter's future. While mother and daughter rested, the world beyond the parsonage walls moved on. The investigation sparked by Evelina's testimony had grown in scope and urgency. Sheriff Jenkins, initially skeptical of the allegations' extent, had gathered enough evidence to justify a larger operation, involving county officials and even a representative from the state's Attorney General's office. One August morning, when Hope was just 3 weeks old, a party of 5 armed men led by the sheriff set out for the mountains and the Caldwell property. Their mission was twofold: to investigate the claims of forced and illegal unions, and to check on the welfare of the women and children still living under Silas's control. What they found surpassed even Evelina's descriptions. The property, seen in the harsh light of official scrutiny, was revealed as a microcosm of misery and decay. Crudely built and dilapidated cabins housed women with vacant stares and children with visible deformities. Silas's own records, a bizarre amalgamation of family tree and lineage control, more reminiscent of animal breeding than human relations, provided irrefutable evidence of the forced consanguinity system that had persisted for at least 4 generations. Silas Caldwell, confronted by outside authority for the first time in his long patriarchal reign, reacted with a mix of religious outrage and incoherent threat. When the sheriff presented the arrest warrant, the old man tried to resist, only to be quickly subdued. "What we do here is sacred," he shouted as he was led away. "The blood must stay pure. You got no right interfering with God's laws." Ezekiel and the other adult men of the family were also detained, accused of crimes ranging from illegal cohabitation to child endangerment. The women and children, many seeing outsiders for the first time, were temporarily placed in a makeshift shelter in town as authorities determined the next steps. News of the Caldwell family and their practices soon spread beyond Rogersville. Newspapers in Knoxville and even Nashville ran sensational reports about the colony of consanguinity discovered in the Tennessee mountains. The case quickly became a talking point for social reformers, doctors interested in genetics, and legislators concerned with gaps in existing law. For Evelina, now settled in a small room behind the general goods store where she'd found work as a helper, the attention was both validating and disturbing. On one hand, the public exposure meant authorities couldn't simply ignore the situation. On the other, the sensational reports often painted all the Caldwells, women and children included, as degenerate mountain folk, ignoring the complex reality of victim and perpetrator. "They treat us like animals in a sideshow," Evelina remarked bitterly to Martha Wilson during a weekly visit, little hope in her arms. "The same people who pretended not to see what was happening in the mountains for decades now want to examine our lives like we're specimens in a lab." The trial of Silas Caldwell and the other family men began in October 1913. The county courthouse was packed beyond capacity. Curiosity seekers from neighboring towns traveled hours to witness what the papers called the mountain trial. Evelina, called as the prosecution's star witness, faced her greatest challenge yet. Dressed in a simple blue dress borrowed from Martha, she walked to the witness stand with her eyes fixed ahead, refusing to look at the defendant's table where Silas, Ezekiel, and the others sat today. When she finally raised her gaze, she met Silas's eyes, not with regret or shame, but with pure fury. The silent message was clear: she had betrayed the family, exposed its secrets, challenged his authority. For 4 hours, Evelina answered the prosecutor's questions, then endured a hostile cross-examination from the defense attorney, a man hired by a local church group that believed the case represented improper government meddling in family affairs. "Miss Caldwell," asked the defense attorney, a thin man with a pencil mustache and calculating eyes, "is it not true you were never legally married to Ezekiel Caldwell? That there was, in fact, no civil ceremony recognized by the state?" There was no legal ceremony, Evelina answered firmly. There was a ritual led by Silas, based on his own twisted reading of scripture. And you participated in this ritual voluntarily, correct? Evelina felt heat rise from her neck to her cheeks. I was 16. I was raised believing I had no choice. It was my duty. Duty to whom, exactly? To the family. To the blood. As Silas always said. The lawyer smiled coldly. And yet, when you decided this duty no longer suited you, you simply ran away. You abandoned your family. Before Evelina could answer, the prosecutor rose to object. Your Honor, the witness is a victim here, not the accused. The judge, an older man whose face was etched with deep lines of expression, nodded. Objection sustained. Counsel will restrict himself to facts relevant to this case. Despite the hostile questioning, Evelina's testimony, buttressed by the records found on the property and Dr. Harrington's medical reports on the condition of the Caldwell children, proved devastating for the defense. In late November, after 3 weeks of testimony, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty. Silas Caldwell was sentenced to 15 years in prison for multiple violations of state marriage laws and coercion. Ezekiel and the other men received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years. The Caldwell women and children faced a different fate. With the property confiscated by the state and no means of support, they were temporarily placed in various charitable institutions. The younger children, especially those with severe impairments, were sent to state-run asylums, a destination that, while different from mountain isolation, rarely offered much better conditions in early 20th century America. Judith, who had risked everything to help Evelina escape, eventually managed to settle on a small farm on Rogersville's outskirts, where she worked as a washerwoman for local families. Her children, including Eli with his special needs, remained with her, a rare victory in a story marked by so much loss. For Evelina, the trial's end brought temporary relief, but not the closure she'd expected. Nights were still often broken by nightmares of being back in Ezekiel's cabin, trapped. On days when she visited the market, she sometimes caught stares and heard whispers that followed her, a mix of morbid curiosity and silent judgment. You'll always be that Caldwell girl, Martha Wilson had said kindly, but with realism. Not to us, but to many in this town. Perhaps it's time to consider a fresh start, somewhere your name and your story don't precede you. The suggestion planted a seed in Evelina's mind. As Hope grew into a pink-cheeked toddler with brown curls and a smile surprisingly free of the past's shadow, Evelina began to consider life beyond Rogersville. It was Dr. Harrington who finally offered the opportunity she needed. Having returned to Knoxville after the trial, he continued his studies on consanguinity's effects, now with a special interest in Hope's development. During one of his regular visits, he made a proposal. The University of Tennessee is establishing a special program to study the genetic effects of various conditions, he explained. They need an administrative assistant, someone to organize files, transcribe notes, that sort of thing. It's not a glamorous post, but it pays reasonably and comes with campus lodging. Evelina, now 18 with her nearly 1-year-old daughter, saw in the offer more than a job. It was a chance to rebuild her life in a place where her past, while not forgotten, wouldn't be the sole thing defining her. In January 1914, with Hope in her arms and a small suitcase holding all her worldly goods, Evelina boarded the train for Knoxville. Gazing out the window as the mountain landscape slid away, she felt a complex swell of emotion. There was sadness for the women and children who couldn't escape, determination to build something better for her daughter, and a growing sense of purpose. What had begun as a desperate flight was now turning into something larger. The Caldwell case, though far from unique, had exposed a dark reality many preferred to ignore, the human cost of generations of isolation and consanguinity in Appalachia's remote communities. The work Evelina would do at the university, however modest, would contribute to an understanding that might one day prevent stories like hers. As the train picked up speed, carrying them from the mountain's shadows toward the city's lights, Hope slept peacefully in her mother's arms. Her future, unlike so many Caldwell children before her, was not predetermined by an inescapable cycle. Whatever life held, Hope would have what her mother had risked everything to win, a choice. Knoxville, 1923. A decade had passed since Evelina Caldwell left the mountains with her newborn. The city, while still modest compared to America's great metropolises, was a world apart from the isolated Appalachian slopes. The University of Tennessee campus, with its red brick buildings and stately oaks, had become home to Evelina and Hope. What began as a temporary administrative post had evolved over the years. Evelina, demonstrating a keen intelligence and thirst for knowledge that decades of isolation couldn't extinguish, eventually secured a position as a research assistant in the Department of Social Studies. Hope, now 10, was a remarkably healthy and bright child. She showed none of the physical or cognitive marks that had plagued so many Caldwell children. With wavy brown hair framing a lively, expressive face, she had her mother's perceptive eyes but carried none of the shadow that sometimes dimmed Evelina's gaze. One particular afternoon, mother and daughter walked the campus, enjoying the early autumn warmth. Hope, dressed in a simple blue dress and polished shoes, held her mother's hand as she chatted. "Mama," Hope asked, her clear voice cutting the afternoon stillness, "why does Dr. Harrington always examine me so carefully when we visit? I'm not sick." Evelina looked at her daughter, carefully weighing her answer. Over the years, she'd grappled with how much to tell Hope of her origins. The girl knew only fragments, that her mother came from the mountains, that her father wasn't in their lives, that they were somehow special to Dr. Harrington's studies. Dr. Harrington is a scientist who studies how families pass traits to their children, Evelina explained, choosing her words. You help him understand important things that can help other children. Hope considered this, her young face serious. Is it because of my father? Because he was kin to you. Evelina stopped walking, feeling as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. Of all the ways she'd imagined this conversation, she'd never considered Hope might have already pieced parts of the truth together on her own. Where did you hear that?" she asked, her voice shakier than she would have liked. Hope shrugged with the blunt frankness of childhood. "I heard Dr. Harrington talking to Professor Wheeler about the Caldwell case, and how I was a remarkable example of a genetic resilience despite parental consanguinity. I looked the word up in the dictionary." Evelina felt a surge of pride in her daughter's cleverness, mixed with despair at not being able to shield her from this truth longer. Guiding Hope to a bench beneath an oak, she sat and drew her daughter close. "There are parts of our story I'd hoped to share when you were older," Evelina began. "But you've always been more insightful than I expected." Over the next hour, sitting beneath the oak as autumn light filtered through golden leaves, Evelina told a simplified but honest version of her history. She spoke of the Caldwell family in the mountains, their isolation, the traditions that forced kin to marry, and her escape to give Hope a different life. Hope listened with an intensity beyond her years, occasionally asking surprisingly sharp questions. When Evelina finished, the girl was quiet for a long moment. "So that's why we don't have other family," she said finally. "And why you never want to go back to the mountains?" "Yes," Evelina answered softly. "But I want you to understand something very important. What happened doesn't define who you are. You're your own person, Hope. Always will be." Hope nodded slowly, processing it all. Then, in a gesture that brought tears to Evelina's eyes, the girl leaned in and hugged her mother tightly. "You were very brave, Mama," she whispered. "Just like in the stories you read me." That conversation marked a turning point. With the past secrets partly revealed, a new honesty bloomed between them. Hope, with her natural curiosity now fed by fragments of family history, began asking more questions, not just about the Caldwells, but about consanguinity, genetics, and the studies in which she and her mother had become an integral part. In 1925, when Hope was 12, Evelina's work with Dr. Harrington culminated in a significant academic publication, Generational Effects of Continuous Consanguinity, a case study from Appalachia. The study, which protected the subject's anonymity while detailing the genetic and social patterns observed in the Caldwell family and similar clans, became an important reference in the emerging field of human genetics. For Evelina, the publication represented a full transformation from silent victim to active contributor to scientific knowledge that might one day prevent situations like hers. It was also around this time that Evelina received an unexpected letter from Rogersville. Martha Wilson, who had remained a faithful correspondent, wrote with news that reopened old wounds. Silas Caldwell had died in the state penitentiary at the age of 80. "I thought you should know," Martha wrote, "that before he died, he asked to speak with a chaplain." No one knows what was said in that final conversation, but the chaplain later remarked that even the hardest heart may eventually face its own truth. The news stirred in Evelina a storm of conflicting feelings. There was no forgiveness in her heart for the man who had perpetuated generations of suffering, yet she felt a strange sense of closure. The letter also contained news of other Caldwell women. Judith, who had stayed in Rogersville, had established a small, informal community with some of the family's former wives who had managed to rebuild their lives after the trial. Together, they ran a small laundry that had become a modest but stable business. "They speak of you often," Martha wrote. "To many of the younger women, you've become a kind of legend. The girl who escaped and changed everything. Some have even sent their own daughters to school, inspired by what they've heard of you and hope." The notion that her escape had somehow paved a way for others was both humbling and empowering for Evelina. The cycle that had seemed unbreakable had been, if not shattered, then significantly weakened. In 1928, when Hope turned 15, the same age Evelina had been when she began planning her escape, mother and daughter made a momentous decision. It was time to revisit the past, literally. The journey back to Rogersville, and eventually to the old Caldwell lands, was not easy. Each mile on the train seemed to pull Evelina deeper into memories she'd worked hard to soothe. But beside her was Hope, strong, confident, curious, a living testament that not all stories are condemned to repeat their darkest chapters. Martha Wilson, now a white-haired widow but with the same kind eyes, met them at the station. The reunion was emotional, with long embraces and tears that spoke more than words. "You've become a remarkable woman," Martha said, holding Evelina's face in her wrinkled hands. "And this must be Hope. My goodness, she has your eyes." The visit with Judith and the other Caldwell women was equally moving. In a small house on the town's edge, Evelina rediscovered women who had shared her childhood, faces now lined with years but bearing a new dignity absent in the property days. "You cleared the path," said Judith, now a middle-aged woman with grey-streaked hair and work-calloused hands. "After you ran, something shifted. It was like you showed us it was possible." The hardest part of the trip was visiting the land that had once been the Caldwells. Abandoned after the trial, the property was now partially reclaimed by the woods. Evelina walked slowly through what had been the heart of the compound, Hope respectfully a few steps behind, and stopped where Silas's main cabin had stood. She felt a tremor pass through her, not of fear or anger, but of a strange liberation. "This place holds no power over me anymore," she said finally, turning to her daughter. "It never will over you." Hope, who had been quiet for most of the exploration, came forward and took her mother's hand. "What happened here, it's part of our history. But it's not our future." On the train back to Knoxville, sitting side by side as the mountains gave way to plains, Evelina reflected on the extraordinary journey she'd traveled, not just the physical distance from the mountains to the university, but the transformation from a terrified, uneducated girl into a woman who now contributed to scientific knowledge and social change. Most of all, she looked at Hope, healthy, intelligent, with a bright future ahead, and saw the true measure of her victory against the Caldwell's dark cycle. In 1930, Hope Caldwell became the first in her lineage to enter university, choosing to study medicine with a focus on genetics, a path directly influenced by her own history. Evelina, now a respected researcher and occasional lecturer on the social and medical effects of community isolation, watched with unutterable pride as her daughter charted a course that would have been unthinkable 2 decades before. Evelina's work, combined with studies by other researchers inspired by her case, eventually influenced changes to state laws on consanguineous marriage and how authorities approached isolated communities. A new approach began to emerge, one that recognized the complexity of such situations and sought interventions that protected the vulnerable while respecting all involved. On a fall afternoon in 1932, 20 years after her flight from the mountains, Evelina Caldwell sat in her university office reviewing notes for a lecture when she received an unexpected visitor. A young woman, visibly nervous and holding a small child, knocked shyly on her door. "Mrs. Caldwell," the visitor asked hesitantly. My name is Sarah. Sarah Jenkins. I come from a community up in the Kentucky mountains. They told me you could help. Looking at the young mother's anxious face, Evelina saw a reflection of herself 2 decades prior, frightened but determined to break a cycle that had trapped generations. With a kind smile, she invited Sarah in and gestured for her to sit. You've already taken the first and hardest step, Evelina said, her voice calm and firm. And yes, I can help you. We can help each other. As the autumn sun cast a golden light through the office window, illuminating the hopeful faces of the young mother and her son, Evelina felt a profound sense of purpose. The story of the Caldwells, her story, had not ended in the isolated Tennessee mountains. It lived on in every woman who found the courage to break cycles of abuse and isolation, in every child born with the chance to define their own destiny. The cruel tradition of consanguinity had been broken, not just for one family, but potentially for many. And in that, Evelina Caldwell found her true liberation. Check to see if you're subscribed to this channel. It is extremely important that stories like this are known, so we can protect future generations from practices that cause such human suffering. If you've watched this far, it's because this story resonates with you. Leave a comment saying watched it all, so I can know you and see who truly values the stories shared here. Don't forget to leave your like and share this with someone who needs to know about this dark reality that existed within our society. Together, we can ensure such practices remain only on the pages of history.